Lillian decided she would not be saved. Not tonight, not ever again. The choice had been made before the city noticed her, before the rain finished drying on the pavement, before fate, coincidence, or whatever people like to name moments they did not understand had any chance to intervene. She was done with being rescued, corrected, or gently guided back into a life that demanded endurance instead of meaning. She was done with surviving in carefully measured doses. And that decision, more than grief, more than exhaustion, more than fear, was what made the night dangerous. New York received her as it received everyone, without recognition, without concern. The air was sharp, metallic with leftover rain and distant exhaust. Light fractured across wet sidewalks in broken reflections that made the city look almost beautiful from far enough away. Up close, it was indifferent. People moved in narrow streams between storefronts and parked cars, faces flattened into silhouettes by speed and purpose. It was the kind of night that erased individuals, that reduced human lives to trajectories and momentum. Lillian walked slowly, not because her body resisted motion, but because her mind resisted arrival. Home meant the weight of her mother's careful supervision, love translated into control. It meant the constant presence of a past that no longer bled but had never healed. Her husband's death in the war was no longer an event that demanded tears. It had become architecture inside her, a silent structure shaping every decision. The kind of grief that did not cry out, but rearranged the interior of a person until there was no obvious place for desire to live. Months earlier, she had made a promise to herself without ceremony or witnesses. No more closeness, no more emotional risks, no more allowing another human being into the vulnerable geography of her life. Not because she believed love was a lie, but because she believed its price was always catastrophic. Loss had taught efficiency. She had learned how to make life smaller, narrower, safer. She had replaced hope with containment and called it maturity. That night, she believed she was finally at peace with the decision. Then Aiden stepped into her path. Not abruptly, not dramatically. There was no collision, no startled apology, no theatrical interruption of movement. The street narrowed, the flow of pedestrians compressed, and trajectories adjusted. In that small recalibration of space, her awareness caught on something that did not belong. Aiden did not move like someone lost. He did not scan the street with hunger or panic. The posture was upright, controlled, almost formal. Clothing was simple, worn at the edges, but carried with a precision that felt out of place in a body that clearly did not belong to any protected category of the city. People without resources usually carried that fact in their shoulders. This man did not. What unsettled Lillian was not the absence of money or address or social coordinates. It was the absence of need. The face registered in fragments at first. The steady eyes that did not beg, the expression that did not perform desperation, the strange calm that suggested the world's indifference had already been studied, measured, and internally filed away. The gaze did not ask for help. It did not look beyond her in search of someone else. It fixed, observed, acknowledged. She felt something respond inside her before thought could intervene. It was not attraction. It was not pity. It was recognition of threat. Not a threat to safety. A threat to the structure she had built her life upon. Standing there under the indifferent light of the city, a sensation surfaced that she had buried so deeply she had mistaken its absence for healing. Not hope. Not romance. Something far more dangerous. The impulse to live rather than endure. The realization did not arrive gently. It cut through her with uncomfortable clarity, a memory of wanting more than what was merely tolerable, of choosing movement instead of stasis, of imagining a future that was not simply a sequence of days survived with minimal damage. And because she recognized the sensation, she recognized the risk. Wanting meant exposure. Wanting meant the possibility of loss. For years, she had learned to evaluate people by what they demanded. Men who entered her life after the war had wanted either her vulnerability or her silence. Some wanted to fix her, treating grief as a defect. Others wanted the comfort of her composure, mistaking restraint for strength. She had learned how to navigate both. She had not learned how to respond to a presence that asked for nothing and yet destabilized everything. She did not know Aiden's history. She did not know the absence of money, of a permanent place, of a biography that could be told without stripping away dignity. What she knew was that the man before her was not empty in the way the city emptied people. There was no theatrical resignation, no emotional leakage. There was discipline, the kind of composure that came not from ease, but from long familiarity with conditions that could not be controlled. She could have walked past. The rational part of her prepared for it automatically. Resume the route. Preserve the careful architecture of solitude. The city would not have punished her. It rarely did. Instead, something older than fear shifted inside her. It was not sentiment. It was not heroism. It was the last remaining function of a moral compass bent by loss, but not fully destroyed. One does not step over what the world has already decided to abandon. She altered her trajectory. The decision was physically small. A slight change in direction, a matching of pace, a silent invitation to share the next stretch of sidewalk. Yet even as it happened, Lillian felt the weight of it. Not because of who Aiden was, but because of what the choice meant for the boundaries she had been guarding since the day she learned that love did not protect anyone from violence. They moved together without words. Aiden walked half a step behind, not in submission, but in consideration. He did not crowd space. He did not test limits. He matched her pace with quiet precision. These were not the instincts of a person accustomed to asking. They were the habits of someone who understood boundaries as structure rather than obstacle. The silence between them was not awkward. It was charged, not with flirtation, but with something more unsettling, the sense that two closed systems were beginning to influence each other. Lillian caught fragments of his reflection in darkened windows. The expression did not soften when she looked. It did not harden either. It remained controlled, as if emotion were something handled carefully, like a tool that could cause damage if used without discipline. For years, she had trained herself to be smaller inside her own life. Desires reduced to what was manageable. Futures limited to what could be endured without reopening the wound that had never fully healed. Yet with each step beside him, the internal structure trembled. Not collapsed, trembled. It would have been easier if he had asked for something. Money, food, a place to sleep, anything that could be given, completed, categorized as charity. But Aiden did not ask. The altered trajectory was accepted as if it were natural, as if the world were simply continuing in the direction it had always intended. That acceptance unsettled her more than any plea could have. When people needed you, the relationship was defined. One could give what was requested and withdraw. When someone needed nothing, when they simply existed beside you with quiet presence, they forced a different kind of reckoning. They made you aware of choice, of agency, of the uncomfortable possibility that what you had been calling survival might, in fact, be a slow form of disappearance. The first hook of the story was not attraction. It was threat, not to her body, but to the narrative she had built about herself. She had believed that closing herself off was strength, that refusing desire was maturity. Now, beside a man with nothing in his pockets and something unyielding in his bearing, she felt the return of wanting. Wanting did not promise happiness. Wanting promised exposure. The city sharpened around them. Light became insistent, sound more distinct. Her awareness of her own body intensified, not sensually, but viscerally, as if reminding her she was still a living organism rather than a carefully regulated system. She had not felt this kind of presence in years. She did not yet know that this night would fracture the geometry of her life, only that something long dormant had been activated without permission. They reached a point where the street widened, where natural separation returned. The moment arrived when shared movement could end without explanation. The rational version of herself prepared to let it. She could still retreat into controlled solitude. She could still protect the architecture she had built from pain. Instead, she did the one thing she had sworn never to do again. She extended her world. Not with words, with motion, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some gestures could not be undone. She allowed Aiden into the next segment of the night, into the personal geography of her life. In doing so, she crossed a boundary she had guarded since the day grief taught her the cost of attachment. Almost immediately, another signal registered. Aiden acknowledged the inclusion not with relief, but with something closer to formality. Gratitude was present, but filtered through control. There was no softening into dependence, no emotional overflow. He accepted the altered course as one might accept a condition of reality rather than a favor. The calm she had first read as humility revealed a sharper edge. This was not the quiet of resignation. It was the stillness of someone who understood power intimately and had learned how to carry its absence without allowing it to define him. The city continued around them, indifferent and relentless. But within the narrow corridor of shared movement, something irreversible had begun. Not a romance, not yet, a destabilization. Lillian did not know Aiden's past. She did not know the scale of what had been left behind or what might be waiting beyond this night. What she knew was that in choosing not to walk away, she had chosen not to remain untouched. For the first time in years, she was no longer merely surviving her life. She was entering it. And the man beside her, with nothing visible to offer and something dangerously intact within, had become the catalyst she had never intended to invite. Lillian learned his name the next morning. Aiden. It sounded simple, almost deliberately empty, as if it had been chosen to carry no weight of origin, no visible history, no inherited meaning. The name did not invite questions. It closed them. She noticed how easily it slipped into her thoughts, how little resistance it met, and that in itself unsettled her. Names were usually anchors. This one felt more like a blank surface. Aiden did not explain where he came from. He did not offer the narrative she had learned to expect from people who had fallen out of the city's structures. There was no rehearsed tragedy, no inventory of misfortune arranged to justify the present. When she asked simple things that would normally summon a story, the answers remained precise and minimal, stripped of emotional ornament. Not defensive, not evasive in a way that invited suspicion. Simply closed. It destabilized her more than any confession of suffering could have. Lillian had grown accustomed to men who responded to her either by trying to rescue her or by retreating from her silence. The first kind treated her grief as a problem to be solved, a fracture they could repair if they were careful or persistent enough. The second kind read her composure as emotional absence and quietly withdrew, unwilling to confront a depth they did not know how to enter. Aiden did neither. There was no attempt to save, no impulse to flee. He did not press into her world, but he did not remove himself from it either. He occupied space with a steadiness that made absence feel impossible and intrusion unnecessary. The days that followed rearranged her routines without asking permission. Lillian did what she had always done when confronted with someone in a vulnerable position. She sought a practical solution. The city offered little in the way of mercy, but it did offer temporary structures for those who could endure its indifference long enough. She made calls. She used small professional connections she had built over years of work. Not favors exactly, more like threads of mutual tolerance that could sometimes be pulled when necessity demanded it. She did not frame what she was doing as charity. It was logistics, a way of imposing order on something that would otherwise remain unresolved. When she told Aiden about the possibility of short-term work, the response was not gratitude in the way people expected gratitude. There was no relief, no visible softening. The information was received as an assignment, a problem presented, a task accepted. He approached the work with the same internal discipline she had already begun to associate with him. There was no self-pity in the way he moved through spaces that clearly regarded him as disposable. He did not perform humility. He did not protest when spoken to sharply, yet something in his posture made it clear that none of it penetrated. The world could treat him as an absence. He refused to become one. Lillian watched this with a mixture of admiration and unease. It was one thing to endure degradation. It was another to do so without internalizing it. Most people learn to survive by shrinking. Aiden survived by remaining intact. She observed how easily the city attempted to erase him, how voices grew sharper when addressing him, how eye contact was avoided or weaponized, how instructions were given as though speaking to an object rather than a person. And she watched how he absorbed none of it. The body remained composed. Movements remained precise. There was no outward rebellion, but there was also no surrender. It did not look like pride. It looked like structure. The closeness that developed between them did not resemble the patterns she knew. There was no playful discovery, no performance of charm, no gentle escalation designed to invite desire. What grew between them was a tension built on mutual recognition of damage. Two people who had been altered by forces larger than themselves and had learned, in different ways, how to continue. Lillian felt that something in her pain became legible in his presence. Not healed, not softened, but organized. With Aiden, the past did not recede. It stood in clearer lines. The war that had taken her husband no longer existed only as a private ache. It became something that could be acknowledged without collapsing into sentiment. She did not need to hide it. She did not need to translate it into something more palatable. It simply existed. She noticed that when the subject of war surfaced in conversation around them, something in Aiden's gaze shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would attract attention. The eyes hardened by a fraction, as if a system of internal locks had engaged. His body registered the word before his mind allowed any visible reaction. The change was subtle enough that others might have missed it. Lillian did not. Money produced a similar response. Any mention of it, any discussion of transactions, wages, costs, or value introduced a tension into his posture. Not longing, not resentment, something more restrained, as though the concept itself were tied to a different reality that he did not wish to invite into the present. And when he was treated with open contempt, when someone spoke to him in a way designed to reduce him, the calm she had come to associate with him fractured slightly. Not into anger, into a tighter stillness, more rigid, more controlled. The world's attempt to define him as nothing met an internal resistance that was never voiced but never absent. Lillian began to understand that Aiden's past was not empty. It was forbidden territory. The attraction between them did not offer comfort. It did not promise escape. It was not the soft gravity of romance. It was the tension of two internal structures recognizing in each other a similar pattern of survival. She felt drawn not to what he lacked, but to what he refused to relinquish. Her own conflict intensified. She had sworn, after the loss of her husband, that she would not allow another person to become central. Attachment, in her experience, had been a contract with catastrophe. Love did not protect, it exposed. She had rebuilt her life around that truth, around independence, around carefully measured proximity, and yet Aiden became the exception she had not planned for. He did not promise anything. He did not sketch a future or imply a direction. He did not attempt to anchor himself to her life. He simply remained present. In that presence, something in her defenses began to erode. She had expected that if she ever allowed someone close again, it would be because she needed them. Comfort, support, distraction from the echo of loss. What unsettled her was that she did not need Aiden in any of those ways. His presence did not fill a void. It created a different kind of awareness, a sense that she was no longer alone inside her own damage. She found herself waiting for the moments they would share space, not out of anticipation for what might happen between them, but for the strange clarity that accompanied his presence. With him, she did not have to manage herself. She did not have to perform stability. The parts of her that were still fractured could exist without explanation. And yet, with every step toward closeness, the internal warning grew louder. She knew what attachment had cost her once. She had learned how quickly a life could be reorganized by loss. She had watched her identity collapse around absence and had spent years reconstructing something functional from the wreckage. To allow another person into that reconstructed structure was to risk another collapse. The tension between desire and self-preservation became the central movement of her days. Every interaction added information. She saw how Aiden oriented himself in unfamiliar spaces, always mapping exits, always maintaining awareness of his surroundings. Not fearfully, strategically. She noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how he absorbed details about people and places without appearing to do so, how his reactions were never impulsive, always filtered through some internal calculus. She noticed the rare moments when that control wavered. A sudden tightening of the jaw, a momentary absence in his eyes. These were not random. They aligned with specific stimuli, references to conflict, to authority, to wealth. Each reaction was a clue, a fragment of a larger structure she could sense but not access. She began to understand that the absence of explanation was not an accident. It was a boundary. What disturbed her most was that he did not ask for anything in return for the space he occupied in her life. No emotional demands, no expectation of caretaking, no attempt to convert proximity into obligation. He accepted what was offered and did not attempt to extract more. This lack of negotiation removed the usual framework she relied on to maintain distance. There was nothing to push against, nothing to refuse. The closeness between them developed in quiet increments, shared movement through the city, parallel routines, the unspoken awareness of each other's presence in rooms where others did not register. It was not intimacy as she had known it. It was something colder, sharper, more precise. A recognition of another consciousness moving through the world with comparable damage. She realized that Aiden did not see her as broken. He did not treat her grief as something that required correction. He did not avoid it either. It simply existed as part of her. This, more than any gesture, altered the internal narrative she had been carrying for years. For the first time since her husband's death, her pain did not isolate her. It connected. That connection frightened her. She had spent years ensuring that no one had the capacity to undo her. She had learned to regulate closeness so that it never reached a point of dependency. Now, without intention, she found herself allowing Aiden into spaces she had kept closed even to herself. The nights were the most revealing. When the city quieted into a lower register of sound, when the movement of the day gave way to something more exposed, she became acutely aware of how his presence altered the shape of her internal world. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt charged with unspoken knowledge. She did not need to explain herself. She did not need to translate grief into language. The shared stillness carried its own meaning. And yet, beneath the stillness, questions accumulated. Who had he been before the city reduced him to this version of existence? What life had taught him to carry himself with such contained authority? Why did the mention of money register not as longing, but as tension? Why did the concept of power, even in casual form, provoke a reaction he could not fully conceal? Lillian understood that there were histories that could not be told without consequence, that some pasts were not merely painful, but dangerous. The city had taught her that too. Still, the knowledge that she was moving closer to a man whose life existed behind a sealed door filled her with an unease she could not name. The internal conflict sharpened. The part of her that wanted to remain untouched by another's secrets clashed with the part that recognized that Aiden's refusal to explain was not manipulation. It was protection, not of himself alone, but of something larger, something that could not be allowed into the fragile equilibrium they were building. She began to understand that his silence was not absence, it was containment. This realization did not make the distance easier to accept, it made it heavier. She wanted to know him, not in the superficial sense of personal history, but in the deeper sense of understanding the forces that had shaped him. She wanted to see the architecture beneath the surface, but she also recognized that to press for that knowledge would be to violate the very structure that allowed him to remain intact. The tension between knowing and preserving became the central dynamic of their closeness. In moments of quiet, she found herself studying the small signs of fracture in his composure, the slight delay before responding to certain topics, the almost imperceptible tightening of his posture when authority entered the room, the way his gaze hardened when confronted with cruelty. These were not random. They were traces of a life that had taught him to navigate power not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality. She began to see that the man beside her was not simply enduring hardship. He was managing himself in the absence of something that had once structured his existence. The discipline she had initially mistaken for emotional distance now revealed itself as the residue of a former order. And still, he did not explain. The attraction between them deepened, not through escalation, but through accumulation. Each shared experience added another layer of recognition. Each moment of silence confirmed that they were not alone in their respective forms of damage. Yet with every step closer, the knowledge that he remained partially inaccessible grew more pronounced. Lillian understood that she was approaching a threshold. On one side lay the safety of distance, the continuation of a life built on controlled proximity and emotional austerity. On the other lay the risk of attachment to a man whose past was not simply unknown, but actively withheld. She did not yet know that this boundary would eventually demand a decision she was not prepared to make. For now, she only knew that something in Aiden's presence had begun to dismantle the walls she had spent years constructing. The closeness did not feel like comfort, it felt like exposure. And the secret he carried, never spoken, never denied, hovered between them like a shadow cast by a structure too large to be seen from where she stood. Lillian sensed, with a clarity that both terrified and compelled her, that whatever lay behind that silence was not empty space. It was a forbidden zone. Lillian took the next step without announcing it, without ritual, without the internal permission she had once required for any form of closeness. Aiden was no longer confined to the margins of her days. He entered the ordinary structures of her life, and by doing so exposed how fragile those structures truly were. He crossed the threshold of the apartment where her mother's presence had always felt less like care and more like surveillance. The space where expectations were framed as concern, where every decision Lillian made was measured against what she should have become by now. Bringing Aiden into that environment was not simply an emotional act. It was a quiet defiance of the narrative that had shaped her since her husband's death. She no longer curated her life to remain harmless, to remain predictable. She allowed another person to witness the tension she lived inside every day. She brought him into her professional world as well, into offices and routines built on hierarchies that rarely acknowledged women like her as decision-makers and never granted men like him even the illusion of protection. She watched how he moved through those spaces, how quickly the social order revealed itself, how easily respect was withdrawn, how rapidly power asserted itself in small humiliations. The world that had always demanded that she be careful now demanded that she choose. Preserve herself by maintaining distance, or accept the cost of standing beside someone who existed outside its rules. What developed between them was not romance in any conventional sense. There were no gestures designed to reassure, no promises offered to soften uncertainty. What formed instead was something closer to an alliance, a partnership shaped by necessity rather than desire, though desire threaded through it in quiet, dangerous ways. They did not share dreams of the future. They shared the mechanics of survival. Decisions were made together. Risks were measured together. The intimacy between them was built not on vulnerability as performance, but on the recognition that each carried damage that could not be undone. The rupture came without warning. They lost their jobs almost at the same time, not because of incompetence, not because of choice, because of the unspoken hierarchies that governed who could be discarded without consequence and who was permitted even the illusion of dignity. The mechanisms were impersonal, a lie repeated until it became official, a complaint from someone whose status transformed falsehood into policy, a social structure that did not require proof to justify removal. Lillian felt the shift immediately. The familiar narrative of endurance cracked. She had spent years believing that survival meant adapting, absorbing, tolerating. That if she remained careful, compliant, invisible when necessary, she could avoid catastrophe. Standing beside Aiden in that moment, watching the system close around him and by extension around her, something inside her refused that logic. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not retreat into damage control. She did not ask how to minimize loss. She asked what it would mean to act. The world expected separation. It expected that she would protect herself by stepping away from a man whose presence now represented liability. It expected that she would rationalize the distance as practicality, as necessity, as maturity. That she would choose safety over loyalty. She did not. That choice altered everything. Instead of allowing the rupture to fracture them, she remained. Not out of defiance alone, but out of a recognition that something essential was at stake. To abandon him in the moment when the world had already declared him expendable would not preserve her. It would erase something inside her she had only just begun to recover. What followed was not dramatic. There were no declarations, no symbolic gestures. There was only the shared recognition that the structures they had relied upon were no longer available, and that something new would have to be constructed from what remained. They chose risk. The decision to begin something of their own did not emerge from ambition or idealism. It emerged from necessity. The smallest possible form of resistance, a business so modest it bordered on naive, conceived not as a vehicle for success, but as a refusal to remain subject to a hierarchy that had already rendered them disposable. It was not about proving anything to the world. It was about proving to themselves that their lives did not have to be built on submission. For Lillian, the effect was immediate and disorienting. Since her husband's death, hope had existed only as a theoretical concept, something she believed in for others but no longer inhabited. What she felt now was not the fragile optimism of recovery. It was momentum, the unfamiliar sensation of movement forward, not in spite of loss but in direct confrontation with it. The days reorganized themselves around this new axis. There were practical concerns, logistical obstacles, moments of doubt that arrived without warning. But beneath it all ran a current of purpose that she had not felt in years. The work was imperfect, the future uncertain. Yet for the first time, she was not merely enduring, she was shaping. And it was precisely at this moment that the tension between them began to sharpen. As they built this fragile structure together, Aiden grew increasingly closed. The presence that had once felt steady now revealed fractures she could no longer ignore. His disappearances became more frequent. Not dramatic vanishing, but absences that left questions suspended in the air. His responses shortened. Information that had once been offered without resistance now remained withheld. It was as though he existed on two distinct planes. Within the space they shared, he remained attentive, controlled, quietly protective. He moved through their work with the same disciplined precision she had always observed in him. But beyond her line of sight, another life continued, one governed by rules she could not access. Lillian felt the shift before she understood it, a subtle recalibration of his presence, a distance that did not manifest as withdrawal but as compartmentalization. The man beside her was still there, still engaged, still grounded. Yet something essential was no longer visible. She began to notice patterns that had not existed before. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered a room, names she did not recognize, schedules that changed without explanation, sudden departures framed as necessity but never fully accounted for. None of it could be defined as betrayal, and yet all of it carried the weight of a life that ran parallel to the one they were building. The intimacy between them, once grounded in mutual exposure, now coexisted with an expanding territory of silence. Fragments of truth surfaced in ways that could not be dismissed, documents that did not align with the simplicity of his current existence, financial movements that made no sense within the narrow margins of their new enterprise, connections that suggested a network far beyond the scale of anything they were constructing together. Lillian did not confront him, not yet. The absence of explanation was not what wounded her. What wounded her was the recognition of a pattern she had lived through before. During the war, she had learned what it meant to exist beside a man who was present in body and absent in every other way. She had learned the particular agony of proximity without access, of loving someone whose internal life remained sealed behind a structure built for survival rather than intimacy. She had learned how that distance could hollow a relationship from within, leaving behind only the form of connection without its substance. Now, standing in the fragile architecture of a life she had chosen rather than inherited, she felt that same old pain resurfacing. The realization was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, each new sign reinforcing the same conclusion. The man beside her was carrying something he could not, or would not, share. And whatever that something was, it had the capacity to dismantle what they were building. Her internal conflict reached its breaking point. To continue was to accept a form of closeness that contained its own erasure. To remain meant living inside a structure where trust was asymmetrical, where one life was fully visible and the other remained deliberately obscured. She had endured that kind of existence once before. It had cost her not only her marriage, but her sense of self. Yet to leave meant another kind of loss. Not the sudden, violent rupture of death, but the slow abandonment of something she had fought to believe in. It meant choosing preservation over connection, safety over intimacy, control over vulnerability. She understood with brutal clarity that this was the moment her life would be defined by a choice she could not later revise. The fragments of truth continued to accumulate, not enough to construct a narrative, but enough to confirm that his silence was not benign. Whatever world he moved within beyond her perception was not neutral. It was structured, organized, governed by stakes that exceeded the fragile scale of their shared existence. And in that recognition, something in her shifted from fear to resolve. She had spent years learning how to survive loss. What she had not learned was how to survive the slow erosion of self that accompanied proximity to a life she could not touch. She could endure absence. She could endure pain. What she could no longer endure was the quiet dissolution of her own agency. The decision did not come with drama. There was no confrontation that night, no demand for explanation, no ultimatum. There was only the internal acknowledgement that to remain was to repeat a pattern that had already destroyed one version of her life. To continue was to accept a future shaped by a man who would never fully arrive. And so she did the one thing she had sworn she would never do again. She chose herself. She withdrew not as punishment, not as retaliation, but as preservation. She created distance where intimacy had once lived. She reasserted boundaries that had only just begun to dissolve. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She simply stepped back from the life they had begun to build together. The pain that followed was immediate and unmistakable. Not the sharp agony of sudden loss, but the deeper, quieter suffering of deliberate separation. She had chosen not to endure another disappearance while standing beside the person who was vanishing. In doing so, she knew she had crossed her own point of no return. Whatever had existed between them was now altered by a truth she did not yet fully understand. That love without transparency was not love as she could survive it. That closeness without shared reality was not intimacy, but exposure without protection. She did not yet know what consequences this decision would carry. She only knew that by stepping away, she had preserved the one thing she had nearly lost again, herself. And in that preservation lay both the cost of her choice and the danger that would follow. The project they had begun out of necessity did not fail the way Lillian had secretly expected it to. Instead, it began to grow. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be romanticized as destiny or miracle, but through a series of small, cumulative victories that restructured her sense of possibility. Each contract secured, each negotiation closed, each risk calculated and executed without collapse, confirmed something she had not allowed herself to believe since the war had taken her husband and reordered her existence around survival. She was not merely enduring life. She was building it. The realization did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with a sharpening of focus. Lillian discovered in herself a capacity for command that had long been dormant beneath grief and restraint. She learned to make decisions without hesitation, to absorb pressure without fracture, to accept responsibility not as burden, but as proof of agency. Where once she had been cautious, now she became deliberate. Where once she had measured her presence against the expectations of others, now she defined the terms of engagement. The world responded. Opportunities multiplied. Recognition followed. Not the performative recognition offered to women who conformed to acceptable narratives of resilience, but the harder kind that acknowledged competence. She became visible in spaces that had once treated her as peripheral. She spoke, and people listened. She demanded, and people adjusted. Yet the more the structure she built expanded, the more apparent the absence at its center became. Success did not replace Aiden. It did not quiet the memory of what had existed between them. If anything, it amplified it. Each achievement stood as proof that the life they had imagined together had been possible, that what they had begun was not naive fantasy, but an authentic alternative to the systems that had tried to reduce them. The irony was unbearable. She had chosen separation to preserve herself, to avoid becoming again the woman who loved someone whose inner world was inaccessible. And now she found herself inhabiting a life that bore the unmistakable imprint of what they had once planned. Independence, agency, movement forward, everything she had wanted, everything she had built without him. The cost of that independence became increasingly clear. Lillian changed. Not in ways that could be easily condemned, not in ways that invited intervention, but in subtler, more consequential dimensions. The softness she had once guarded so fiercely gave way to a cultivated hardness. Not cruelty, but insulation. She learned how to maintain distance not only from others, but from her own vulnerability. She mastered the posture of authority, the language of control, the strategic calm that prevented emotion from compromising position. Power became a shield. She told herself that this transformation was strength, that love was a liability, that trust was a structural weakness. The world had not rewarded openness. It had rewarded clarity, decisiveness, and the willingness to act without emotional negotiation. She embraced those rules not because she believed in them, but because they worked. The nights were the only spaces where the narrative fractured. In the quiet, when the day's calculations no longer demanded her attention, the absence of Aiden became unbearable in a way success could not mitigate. Not as longing alone, but as an unresolved question that pressed against the interior architecture of her life. She had not simply lost a man. She had lost the version of herself that had existed in relation to him. The woman who had allowed closeness without guarantees, who had believed, however briefly, that intimacy did not require control, who had risked dismantling the structures of self-protection she had built after the war. That woman did not survive the choice she had made. In her place stood someone more efficient, more resilient, less open. She told herself this was growth. The truth arrived not as revelation, but as intrusion. It did not come from him. He remained absent, inaccessible, sealed within whatever reality he had returned to. Instead, it emerged indirectly, through the mechanisms of the world she was now navigating, through documents that did not align with the simplicity of his former circumstances, through financial records that surfaced in contexts where his name should not have existed, through references embedded in contracts, in correspondence, in systems of movement that only those with considerable influence could access. At first, she dismissed the anomalies as coincidence, as misinterpretation, as the inevitable byproduct of operating in environments more complex than those she had previously inhabited. But the patterns persisted. Each fragment, taken alone, could be rationalized. Together, they formed a structure too deliberate to ignore. The name appeared in places it should not have. Transactions carried signatures that echoed the identity he had never shared. Associations emerged that suggested a network of power, not peripheral influence, but central command. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as rage. Not the explosive anger of betrayal discovered, but the colder, more corrosive fury of understanding what had been denied. Everything that had existed between them, every moment of shared vulnerability, every act of endurance, every humiliation he had accepted, had been framed by a lie so fundamental that it destabilized her entire memory of their closeness. She did not experience herself as a woman deceived. She experienced herself as a person stripped of the right to choose with full knowledge. The distinction mattered. Had he simply been dishonest, she could have processed the pain as personal betrayal. But this was something else. The life they had shared had not been merely incomplete. It had been constructed atop a reality she had not been permitted to see. She had been asked to offer trust without access to the conditions that made trust meaningful. Her anger was not born of wounded pride. It was born of violated autonomy. She had chosen him believing that the risk was emotional. She had not been allowed to consider that the risk might be existential. And yet, as the truth continued to surface, another realization followed, more devastating in its implications. He had not merely hidden wealth, he had relinquished it. The world that now revealed itself to her was not one he had been trapped in unwillingly. It was one he had abandoned, voluntarily, completely, without contingency. The records made it unmistakable. The transfers that predated his disappearance. The legal structures that indicated a deliberate withdrawal. The absence of safeguards that any person of power would have maintained if the intention had been anything other than total renunciation. He had not been pretending to be nothing. He had chosen to become nothing. This understanding did not soften her anger. It sharpened it into something more complex. Every humiliation he had endured, every dismissal, every moment the city had attempted to erase him, every instance in which he had allowed himself to be treated as disposable, none of it had been necessary. None of it had been unavoidable. All of it had been accepted by choice. She had witnessed that endurance and believed it to be the condition of his existence. She now understood it as a test. And in that test, she had been central. The closeness they had shared had not been a refuge for a man with no alternatives. It had been a deliberate construction of a life stripped of the power, protection, and privilege he could have reclaimed at any moment. He had chosen to inhabit vulnerability not as performance, but as reality. And within that reality, she had not been an accessory. She had been the axis. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought devastation. If his silence had been manipulation, she could have rejected him without complication. If his absence now were indifference, she could have grieved and moved forward. But the emerging truth suggested something far more intolerable, that his concealment had not been designed to deceive her, but to protect something he believed could not survive exposure. Her. He had not withheld the truth because he did not trust her. He had withheld it because revealing it would have destroyed the world they were attempting to build. The implications were unbearable. She reinterpreted every moment of restraint, every refusal to explain, every boundary he had maintained not as distance, but as discipline. Not as emotional withdrawal, but as containment. The silence she had experienced as exclusion now appeared as an act of protection that had cost him everything he had once been. The rage did not disappear, but it transformed. It turned inward. She confronted a truth that destabilized the certainty she had built around her decision to leave. She had believed she was choosing autonomy over erasure, that she was refusing to become again the woman who loved a man she could not access, that she was preserving herself. Now she understood that in stepping away, she had not rejected a man who was absent. She had rejected a man who had sacrificed an entire world to exist beside her without power. The realization did not redeem his deception. It complicated it beyond resolution. She found herself standing inside a contradiction she could not reconcile. On one side lay the principle that no relationship built on fundamental untruth could be sustained, that love without transparency was not love as she could survive it. On the other lay the recognition that the truth he had withheld was not incidental. It was structural. It was not a detail. It was an identity that, once revealed, would have transformed every dynamic between them. He had not simply been another man with secrets. He had been a man who had chosen to live without his own name in order to encounter her outside the gravity of power. This knowledge hollowed her. She felt not merely angry, but implicated, as though her desire for a world free of hierarchy had been both honored and betrayed by the very act that made it possible. He had given her exactly what she had believed she wanted, a relationship untainted by status, by wealth, by asymmetry of power. And he had done so by annihilating the context that would have made such equality impossible. The cost of that annihilation was a secret he had never allowed her to see. In the midst of her growing authority, in the expanding architecture of a life built on command and independence, this truth corroded her from within. The power she now wielded felt suddenly insufficient, not because it was illegitimate, but because it had been purchased at the price of a connection she now understood in an entirely different light. She had become what she believed she needed to be. But she had done so by abandoning what she had not known she was losing. The question that emerged was inescapable. Had his lie been betrayal? Or had it been a sacrifice that demanded more from him than any truth ever could? She did not yet have an answer. What she had was a life expanding in every visible direction, and a secret that made that expansion feel increasingly hollow. The power she had cultivated protected her from pain, but it also isolated her from the one experience that had made vulnerability feel meaningful rather than destructive. The growth continued. So did the erosion. By the end of this chapter of her life, Lillian stood not as a woman who had been deceived, nor as one who had been rescued, but as someone confronted with the most unbearable ambiguity. That the greatest violation of her autonomy may also have been the most profound act of devotion she had ever encountered. And that understanding did not free her. It bound her to a question that would no longer allow her to exist in the certainty she had constructed. Not about him. About herself. Aiden returned without ceremony. There were no dramatic gestures designed to reclaim what had been lost. No gifts. No attempts to soften the rupture with material proof of devotion. He did not arrive as a conqueror restored to power, nor as a penitent seeking absolution through spectacle. He arrived as a man who had resolved a war she had never been allowed to see, and who now stood inside the consequences of that victory. The external conflict that had once pulled him out of her life was over. Whatever structures of power had required his disappearance had been confronted. Whatever battles had demanded his full return to the world he had abandoned had been fought. From the perspective of that hidden reality, he had prevailed. From hers, he had already lost. Lillian did not experience his return as relief. She did not feel the sudden restoration of what had been taken. The person who re-entered her world carried the same physical presence, the same disciplined restraint, the same gravity that had once drawn her in. And yet, the knowledge she now possessed altered the entire meaning of that presence. The man before her was no longer simply the figure who had shared empty streets and cold evenings, who had endured with her the small humiliations of a life lived without protection. He was also the embodiment of everything that had been withheld: power, wealth, a network of influence vast enough to restructure realities with a single decision. He was both the man she had known and someone irreversibly foreign. The anger that rose in her was not emotional chaos. It was precise, focused. The anger of a person who understood that what had been taken from her was not merely truth, but the right to consent to the shape of her own life. She did not feel betrayed in the language of romance. She felt violated in the language of autonomy. She did not confront him with accusations meant to wound. She did not collapse into the familiar posture of the abandoned. Her response was colder, more exacting. The man before her was not a symbol of wealth. He was not the return of a lost lover. He was the architect of a reality she had not been permitted to evaluate. She saw, with devastating clarity, the two lives he had carried. The life she had known, stripped of privilege, shaped by endurance, bound to her through shared exposure and mutual survival. And the life he had concealed, governed by leverage, defined by stakes measured in numbers she had never been allowed to imagine, sustained by a system of power that rendered the suffering they had endured together unnecessary. The coexistence of those two truths did not cancel one another out. They collided. Aiden did not attempt to diminish what he had done. There were no narratives designed to reframe his silence as misunderstanding or accident. He did not describe his absence as obligation alone. He did not defend the choice to withhold his identity as strategy. He did not ask her to interpret the deception as something other than what it was. He acknowledged it as a violation, not of trust in the abstract, but of her freedom to choose. He did not offer repentance through emotion. He offered it through consequence. The truth was no longer something she had to excavate from fragments and documents. It was placed fully in her field of vision, stripped of its protective layers. The world he belonged to was no longer hidden. The structures that had governed his disappearance were no longer sealed. And in revealing them, he did not present himself as master of that world. He presented himself as someone willing to dismantle its authority over the life they had begun to build. This was not redemption, it was exposure. He did not offer luxury as compensation. He did not suggest that wealth could repair the damage of a stolen choice. He did not promise protection in exchange for forgiveness. Instead, he placed before her a proposition that was not designed to persuade, but to return what had been taken. He offered her partnership, not ownership, not security purchased through dependence, but the preservation of what she had created on her own terms, the world she had built in his absence, the people she had chosen, the principles she had refused to compromise. He did not ask her to enter his life. He asked to enter hers, and to do so without secrecy. For Lillian, this did not resolve the central wound. It exposed it. She had learned how to survive loss. She had learned how to reconstruct herself after catastrophe. What she had not learned was how to stand inside a reality where the person she had loved had simultaneously been authentic and profoundly false, where devotion and deception were not opposites, but entangled expressions of the same choice. The illusion that collapsed was not the belief that he had been poor. It was the belief that the life they had shared had existed in isolation from power, that their intimacy had been untouched by the forces that structured inequality, authority, and control. She understood now that even their most fragile moments had been framed by a reality he had been actively holding back. The devastation did not take the form of despair. It took the form of disorientation. She could not return to the woman who had loved him without knowing who he was, but she could not dismiss the reality of what they had been to each other. The man before her was not a stranger. He was not simply the embodiment of a lie. He was the same consciousness that had stood beside her in the margins of the city, who had endured not because he had to, but because he had chosen to exist in a world stripped of his own protections in order to meet her as an equal. This realization did not absolve him, but it transformed the meaning of his deception. What he had done was not the concealment of an affair or the performance of a false identity for advantage. It had been the deliberate renunciation of everything that would have made their connection asymmetrical. He had not lied in order to possess her. He had lied in order to encounter her without power. This knowledge did not erase her anger. It deepened it. Because the cost of his choice had not been borne by him alone. It had been borne by her in the form of a life shaped by incomplete information, of decisions made without access to the full terrain, of vulnerability extended under conditions she had never been allowed to evaluate. She did not see herself as wrong for having left. She saw herself as having acted on the only truth she had been given. And yet, standing before him now, she was forced to confront the complexity she had once believed she had escaped. The choice before her was no longer between safety and intimacy. It was between certainty and possibility. She could preserve the life she had built in his absence, a life defined by autonomy, authority, and the hard clarity of self-determination, a life where she answered to no one, where power was something she wielded rather than something that defined her, where emotional exposure was unnecessary and therefore avoidable. Or she could step back into a relationship that would demand something far more dangerous. Trust without guarantees. Not the naive trust of first attachment, but the deliberate acceptance of uncertainty. The recognition that no knowledge, no transparency, no contractual equality could eliminate risk. That to choose him now would not be to reclaim what had been lost, but to enter a future that could not be secured through control. She understood with brutal precision what was being asked of her. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Choice. A choice to engage with a man who had been transformed by the path they had walked together, not because he had returned victorious, but because the journey through vulnerability had altered the architecture of his identity. He was no longer the figure who had once inhabited power without question. The world he had reclaimed was now one he no longer accepted as neutral. The life he offered her was not one of dominance, but of shared construction. Yet the absence of guarantees remained. There was no promise that he would not be pulled again into the gravity of his former world. No assurance that the structures he now exposed would not reassert themselves. No certainty that the equality he now offered could withstand the realities of power. Lillian recognized that what he placed before her was not safety. It was risk. Not the reckless risk of passion, but the existential risk of choosing connection in a world where connection could never be fully protected from the forces that sought to shape it. She did not make the decision in a moment of emotional collapse. She did not surrender to longing. She weighed the life she had built against the life she might choose. She examined not what he could offer her materially, but what he represented in relation to her own becoming. The woman she had become in his absence was stronger, more autonomous, less willing to compromise. But she was also more isolated, more armored, more removed from the part of herself that had once believed in intimacy as something other than vulnerability to destruction. She asked herself whether the self she had preserved was the self she wished to remain. And in that question, she found the answer. She did not offer absolution. She did not pretend that the past could be undone. She did not collapse into the illusion of restored innocence. What she gave was not forgiveness. It was a chance. Not because he was powerful. Not because he had returned. But because she recognized that the man before her had not been unchanged by their shared path. That he had been altered not by victory, but by the experience of existing without the structures that once defined him. That the discipline, the restraint, the silence she had once experienced as exclusion were now directed not toward concealment, but toward the dismantling of the very hierarchies he had once inhabited. She chose not safety, but possibility. Not the protection of certainty, but the vulnerability of a future that could not be controlled. The illusions that had once structured her understanding of love collapsed completely. Love was not rescue. It was not sacrifice that erased asymmetry. It was not truth without cost. It was the decision to remain present in the face of uncertainty, to engage not because the outcome was secure, but because the alternative was a life built entirely on defense. Her choice did not restore what had been lost. It redefined what could still be built. And in that redefinition lay both the danger and the meaning of everything that would follow. Lillian entered Aiden's world without illusions. There was no moment of dazzled surrender, no intoxication with scale or privilege. The architecture of his reality revealed itself in layers. The breadth of influence, the density of networks, the way decisions traveled outward from a single center and reshaped lives far beyond any visible boundary. Power here was not abstract. It was operational. It moved through contracts, institutions, logistics, jurisdictions. It did not announce itself. It functioned. For the first time, Lillian stood inside a domain that could have absorbed her completely if she had allowed it. And for the first time, her primary fear was not that she would lose him. It was that she would lose herself. She did not arrive as a guest. She did not move as someone grateful for access. She did not adopt the posture of a woman entering a world defined by someone else's authority. From the beginning, her presence carried an unspoken condition. She would not become an extension of his power. She would not be protected at the cost of agency. She would not be reduced to a narrative of elevation through association. Equality was not something she requested. It was something she enacted. She claimed the right to influence, to question, to oppose, to exist not as a beneficiary of his decisions but as a participant in them. When structures were revealed, she examined them. When processes were explained, she challenged their assumptions. When strategies were proposed, she evaluated not their efficiency alone, but their ethical weight. The world did not bend easily. It was accustomed to deference, to compliance masked as loyalty, to admiration mistaken for partnership. Lillian did not offer any of these. Her presence introduced friction into systems designed to operate without it. She did not seek to dominate. She refused to disappear. And in doing so, she tested not only the architecture of Aiden's influence, but the transformation he had claimed within himself. He did not respond with defensiveness. He did not attempt to reassert authority. The change she had sensed in him during his return now revealed its depth. His wealth no longer functioned as a weapon. It did not move through intimidation or entitlement. It was deployed as a tool, directed not to consolidate dominance, but to alter structures that had once been invisible to him. He dismantled practices he had previously accepted as inevitable. He interrupted systems that benefited him but harmed others. He redirected resources toward those who had never existed within his field of concern. These were not gestures of repentance. They were reconfigurations of identity. The world he had reclaimed was not the world he now inhabited. The values he had once inherited without reflection were no longer sufficient. Power in his hands no longer existed to reinforce hierarchy. It existed to interrogate it. Lillian did not romanticize this shift. She did not interpret it as proof of moral perfection. She recognized it as what it was: the difficult, ongoing work of becoming someone else in a world that constantly attempted to restore him to what he had been. Their union ceased to resemble refuge. It did not offer escape from pain or a sanctuary from complexity. It was not built on the fantasy that love could compensate for damage or erase history. Instead, it took the form of a partnership in which each retained sovereignty over their own becoming. She was no longer the woman defined by loss. Grief did not disappear. It did not need to, but it no longer organized her existence. She did not move through life as someone permanently oriented toward what had been taken. She moved as an active subject, shaping outcomes rather than absorbing them. The strength she had cultivated in isolation did not dissolve in connection. It found a new articulation. Aiden was no longer the man without a name, nor the shadow of his own power. He was a person who had learned, through the renunciation of everything that once defined him, what it meant to remain present without masks. The discipline that had once structured his concealment now structured his transparency. The restraint that had once maintained distance now maintained accountability. What bound them was not need. It was recognition. They did not complete one another. They did not rescue one another from previous versions of themselves. They encountered each other as two individuals who had been fundamentally altered by their shared path and had chosen, consciously, to continue that alteration together. The dynamic between them was not effortless. There were conflicts that did not resolve through affection. There were disagreements that could not be softened by sentiment. Lillian did not hesitate to oppose him when decisions threatened to replicate the hierarchies he now claimed to reject. Aiden did not retreat into authority when challenged. The friction between them did not weaken the bond. It defined it. They did not confuse intimacy with agreement. They did not mistake unity for uniformity. What emerged was a form of connection rare precisely because it refused the mythology of romantic salvation. Love did not arrive as healing. It arrived as commitment to remain present in the face of irreducible difference, to choose engagement over withdrawal, to accept that equality was not a state to be achieved once, but a condition that required constant negotiation. Lillian understood that to exist beside him would always involve proximity to forces larger than any individual will. Power did not vanish simply because it was acknowledged. Wealth did not become neutral because it was deployed with conscience. The world they inhabited remained complex, stratified, resistant to transformation. She did not ask him to abandon it. She asked him to confront it. And she demanded the right to do so alongside him, not behind him. This was the condition of her presence. In moments of quiet, when the mechanisms of influence receded into the background, what remained between them was not the tenderness of rescue, but the steadiness of mutual recognition. They did not hold each other as survivors clinging to reprieve. They stood as two people who had chosen to construct a shared reality without surrendering their autonomy. The final shape of their relationship did not conform to narrative expectations. It was not sanctified by ceremony. It was not validated by spectacle. It did not culminate in promises designed to reassure the world that love had resolved uncertainty. What it offered was more fragile and more demanding. The right to remain together without falsehood. The acceptance that no structure, no agreement, no affection could guarantee permanence. The willingness to choose one another, not because the outcome was secure, but because the act of choosing itself was meaningful. For Lillian, this was the transformation that mattered. She no longer sought protection from pain. She no longer organized her life around the avoidance of loss. She accepted that to live fully was to remain exposed to what could not be controlled. What distinguished this exposure from the devastation of her past was not its absence of risk, but the presence of agency. She was not being saved. She was choosing. Aiden did not stand beside her as a redeemer. He stood as an equal. And in that equality, love ceased to be a refuge from the world. It became a way of inhabiting it. The world beyond them did not soften. It remained cold, complex, often indifferent. Structures of power continued to assert themselves. Inequities did not dissolve because two people had chosen differently. But within that world, something rare had been constructed. A relationship not built on illusion, not sustained by imbalance, not justified by sacrifice alone. It was sustained by choice. Again and again. Not because it promised happiness, but because it honored truth. Not because it erased pain, but because it refused to let pain define the limits of what could be lived. Their story did not conclude with certainty. It concluded with something far more demanding. The right to remain together without lies. Even if the world grew cold again. Even if power shifted. Even if the future offered no guarantees. What they had chosen was not salvation. It was partnership. And in that partnership, love was no longer an escape. It was an act of presence. One they would have to perform, deliberately, every day. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.